Ric Flair is a true legend of wrestling, and he's always been known for being easy to work with when the bell rang. But even for the Nature Boy, there were a few people in the business who failed to meet his expectations. In today's video, we're taking a look at those wrestlers who rubbed Slick Rick up the wrong way. For many years, the Four Horsemen were known as the elite wrestling stable. They were the coolest team in the business, alongside Tully Blanchard. But that lineup couldn't last forever, and over the years, WCW tried to recreate the glory days of the Horsemen by replacing various members. The likes of Sting, Sid Vicious, and Lex Luger were all rotated in and out of the group during the late 80s and early 90s, but the team was never as good as that original lineup. The fans had been excited to see who was going to replace Tully Blanchard in the group, but when Flair introduced Roma as his replacement on Flair for the gold, the response from the fans was terrible. The fans in the arena booed as the man himself stepped onto the set. The Four Horsemen was a faction that was built on reputation, and Roma brought nothing to the table. In the years since, Roma has gone on the record several times and angrily attacked Flair for rejecting him all those years ago, even saying that Flair was jealous of his good looks and physique. But to Flair, this wasn't just about Roma himself. It wasn't personal. It was about protecting the group's legacy. The 1993 version of the Four Horsemen ended up as one of the least successful incarnations, and it wasn't long before the team disbanded once again. It was just a year later, in 1994, that Eric Bischoff took control of WCW when he became senior vice president. There's no doubt that Bischoff reinvented World Championship Wrestling. He took the business to new heights, and thanks to him, the company finally started to turn a profit. But during the Bischoff era, Flair started to feel like he was being pushed aside. He felt that Bischoff didn't respect his legacy and that he was being overlooked in favor of Bischoff's best friend, Hulk Hogan. Flair just couldn't believe that he was being sidelined after he'd spent the last 20 years being the company's #1 main star. The turning point came in 1998 when Flair decided to not show up for a TV taping of Thunder in favor of attending his son's amateur wrestling tournament. Bischoff took this as a violation of his contract and suspended Flair. And of course, when Flair heard about this, he was infuriated because plenty of the other wrestlers on the WCW roster were getting away with far worse at the time. The feud between Flair and Bischoff soon spilled onto the screen in a storyline that turned the Four Horsemen into a joke. Flair and his crew were continuously beaten down by Bischoff's NWO, and despite the fans being desperate to see the Horsemen get their revenge, Bischoff booked them to lose over and over again. Commenting on his time working for Bischoff, Flair said, "I hated it, the worst. While I was out of sight, out of mind, it didn't work. He kept trying to lose me. He thought he could take me off TV and bury me. He forgot where I'd been for 20 years, 25 years before I met him. You don't lose 25 years of being the man and then all of a sudden have someone try and put you in the back of the pack. He beat my brains out though. That was a big time loss. Self-confidence, period." In my life, while Bret Hart has gone down in history as one of the most respected wrestlers of his generation, back in 1992, he was still proving himself. You might think that a feud with the Nature Boy would have helped enhance Hart's reputation, but the Hitman was far from happy with Flair. Bret beat Flair to win his first WWF title, but he wasn't pleased with the quality of the match. Bret believed that Rick only put half the effort in and ruined what should have been the happiest moment of his career. But Flair has always defended his performance. He's always said that he was wrestling with a severe inner ear injury at the time, after he'd been battered by the Ultimate Warrior in a match the week before. Apparently, this affected his balance and left him struggling to even stand, let alone wrestle at his usual standard. But Bret has never bought this explanation. He's criticized Flair for being a so-called routine man, or a wrestler who relies on the same moves match after match in the same order. And those comments obviously pissed Flair off royally. "I feel sorry for Bret Hart," he said. "He's a legend in his own mind. He lives in his own little world. He has the nerve to compare himself to me. Let's get realistic. If you put Bret Hart in your left hand and me in your right, compare the careers. Who is Bret Hart? He wrestled everybody in the business. I'm the only guy that's wrestled everybody, from Bruiser Brody to The Rock. Bret Hart? He came from a very strong family that was very well recognized and highly thought of. But here are the facts. He never wrestled anybody except in the WWF. When the WWF was hot, he was in the Hart Foundation. He didn't have to draw any money. He just rode around on Hogan's coattails. And when they made him the champion, he couldn't draw a dime. They couldn't wait to get rid of him. When he came to WCW, he bombed. Does that make him a big star? In my world, he's a nobody. He's a pissant in the history of wrestling. Flair's issues with Bret Hart were rooted in the differences in in-ring style and legacy, whereas his feud with Vince Russo was very different. This was all about booking philosophy and the fact that Russo drove WCW into the ground. When Russo took over as the lead booker in WCW, he aimed to reinvent the product with shocking and outrageous storylines. Flair saw Russo's approach as a complete disregard for everything that WCW had once stood for. If Flair represented class and tradition, Russo represented lowbrow, car crash TV. Flair's frustrations only grew as Russo wrote storylines for him personally that humiliated him on national television. One angle saw Flair forced into a head-shaving segment, which he felt was beneath his career and his reputation. Russo even did an angle where Rick was buried in the desert with absolutely no explanation as to why. Russo also made himself the World Heavyweight Champion and even put the title on D-list actor David Arquette, which totally cheapened the belt that Flair had given so much value to in the decades before. Russo claimed that all of these cheap stunts would help increase the ratings, but all it really did was accelerate the death of WCW. Shane Douglas notoriously had a big problem with Ric Flair during the 90s. Back in 1989, Douglas got a job with WCW, and he was excited to work alongside Flair, who he'd always idolized growing up. Douglas claims that when he asked Flair for feedback on one of his matches, Flair brushed him off and totally ignored him. Douglas started to believe that Flair wasn't just dismissive, but that he was actively trying to hold him back. I mean, anyone would be paranoid after being lumbered with the dynamic dudes gimmick, but I very much doubt that that was Flair's fault. In ECW, Douglas went on the offensive, using his promo time to take shots at Flair. Douglas called him Dick Flair and described him as a washed-up has-been, someone who cared more about protecting his own status rather than helping the next generation of wrestlers. This went over huge in ECW, of course, as the fans lapped up his anti-establishment attitude. Flair himself was very well aware of Douglas's rhetoric towards him, and later they had a half-assed feud with each other, but you could tell that Flair just didn't care. In fact, Flair has always been dismissive of Douglas, which must have absolutely driven him crazy. Who is Shane Douglas? He's a clerk at Kmart now, please. He's got more heat with the guys in this business than anybody I've ever met in my life. He cracked on the clique, with all those guys. God, he's obnoxious. While Flair dismissed Douglas for being a nobody, he couldn't do the same with Scott Steiner. Their issues reportedly began in 1991 during a match at the Clash of the Champions. It was Steiner versus Flair in the main event for the World Heavyweight Championship. Steiner believed that Flair didn't sell properly for him during their match, which made him look bad and affected his chances of main eventing again in the future. Steiner carried that grudge for nearly a decade, and when the time came, he didn't hold back. In the year 2000, he took to the mic on Nitro and unleashed a blistering, unscripted promo that tore into Flair. He called Flair's career dead, accused him of stealing the Nature Boy gimmick from Buddy Rogers, and didn't hesitate to label him as a jealous old bastard. Steiner's rant earned him a brief suspension, but that didn't satisfy Flair, who reportedly tried to get him fired over the incident. Scott Steiner really made Ric's life difficult during the final year of WCW, and he continued his violent verbiage towards him for decades after. The feud between Flair and Mick Foley all started thanks to what Mick wrote in his autobiography. He said that Flair's time as WCW booker was as bad as he was good in the ring, which led Flair to respond in his own book, where he branded Foley as a glorified stuntman. They both ended up backstage together in WWE, and Flair offered a handshake to Foley, but Foley refused. That led to a scuffle between the men before it was broken up. The men ended up having an on-screen feud together that was actually a lot of fun. It's been reported that they eventually patched things up and are now on friendly terms with each other.